Hello, my name is Melissa Edwards. I'm an Associate Professor at the UTS Business School. I'm very pleased to be here today at the Better Futures Forum and being able to be part of a roundtable discussion on the decarbonisation of value chains, particularly focused on the challenges for SMEs. One of the things we identified in our discussion is that SMEs make up a large proportion of businesses in Australia by total number, and they also have a responsibility perhaps for somewhere between 15 to 30% of carbon emissions. SMEs are often embedded within the value chains of large corporations. So when we've got companies who are increasingly concerned not only about their own Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, Scope 3 and the ability to understand where emissions are amongst the value chain for their customers, for their suppliers, is increasingly important. And this is where we had a discussion around it really being a collective problem. So solving decarbonisation for industries in Australia is not going to be solved by big business alone or small to medium-sized enterprises, but rather the cooperation and collaboration across value chains. So some of the discussion we wanted to have were what are some of the radical solutions that we can work towards and that we think both individuals within those supply chains, but also customers, governments, non-government organisations, intermediaries can play in being able to make the transparency across that value system to then be able to collectively solve the problem of decarbonisation, not to put that on one entity or another. So that was a really productive starting point. Some of the things that we raised would be having a product level storyline so that people know across the various different points in the supply chain what they're buying into, in a sense, when they take a certain product or a certain supply into their own, whether it's a manufacturing process or at the point of consumption. So what does that product level storyline look like? One of the important things to have that product level storyline would be a way of being able to identify a common metric that we can agree on. It may not be the most accurate measure, but it needs to be centrally agreed upon, possibly by some government mechanism or an honest broker. What would an honest broker do? An honest broker might be the place where SMEs, big businesses, NGOs, consumers can come together and share information and data about the emissions, not only emissions, but also their materials, the people, resources, inputs that they're using across their value chain, and really start to look at how can they collectively share responsibility for decarbonising. How can they collectively share the responsibility for dematerialising aspects of their supply chain? How can they share the responsibility for ensuring people are treated fairly and that true value is being returned to the communities within which they're operating? And I think this is part of another radical solution we threw on the table. Australia's matured in a discussion recently around a reconciliation, and we've been very fortunate here in the forum to hear Indigenous First Nations voices in that process. In that same way, where we're reaching a conversation around reconciliation, maybe it's time for us to have a conversation around us all being part of the climate problem. And once we're all at the point of understanding that we're all part of the problem, then we can all start to understand how we can work together towards those solutions. What would that look like for decarbonising value chains in Australia? Underneath that, SMEs are central to this conversation. They're embedded in local communities. They're often more responsive to their customers, they're more agile, and they have real concerns around the costs of running their businesses. So what if we actually were able to lift the capability of SMEs in the way that they're able to understand how they contribute towards the climate solution through a broader way of thinking about that climate solution? So ultimately, what is their contribution towards the Sustainable Development Goals? If we had a way of doing this, then we might be able to understand the contribution that SMEs are making overall to the Australian economy. And it's probably a lot more than we're getting at the moment.